Montana Territory, 1883. The wild Montana winter roared outside the lonesome cabin that had become Kieran Keller's refuge from the world. At 26, most men his age sought fortune or family, but Kieran had long since convinced himself he needed neither. The flickering oil lamp cast long shadows across rough-hewn walls as he sat cleaning his Colt revolver, his only true companion for nearly 3 years of solitude. "Another night, another reminder," he muttered to the empty room. The cabin creaked under the assault of bitter wind, a sound he'd grown accustomed to since purchasing this remote piece of land after the war. The small cattle operation he'd built was enough to keep him fed and clothed, but not enough to attract attention, precisely as he preferred it. Kieran ran a hand through his dark blonde hair, grown longer than he usually kept it. His lean face, tanned from long days under the Montana sun, remained handsome despite the seriousness that had settled into his features. The small mirror hanging crookedly on the wall reflected a man physically young, but with eyes that had seen too much. He'd earned his reputation as a skilled rancher, fair in his dealings but not one for socializing. The nearest town, Silver Creek, saw him only when supplies ran low or cattle needed selling. Townsfolk whispered about the young, handsome cowboy who spoke little and revealed less. Some speculated he was running from the law, others claimed heartbreak. None knew the truth, that Kieran Keller believed the frontier demanded solitude from those who wished to survive it. "A man who depends on others ends up disappointed or dead," his father had told him before a stray bullet during a cattle rustling had proven the point. Kieran had been 17 then, old enough to finish raising himself and young enough to believe the lesson absolute. The mantel above his small fireplace held his only keepsakes: a silver pocket watch that had been his grandfather's, a daguerreotype of his parents on their wedding day, and a single book of Whitman's poetry his mother had cherished. No photographs of friends, no letters from sweethearts. Kieran had made certain of that. As he reassembled his revolver with practiced hands, a particularly fierce gust rattled the windows. The temperature was dropping faster than he'd anticipated. Even inside, his breath formed small clouds. Montana winters killed the unprepared, and though February was nearly over, spring seemed a distant promise. "Better check on the stock," he said, rising from his chair. The animals were his livelihood and responsibility. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped a wool scarf around his neck, and tugged his hat low over his forehead. The instant he opened the door, Arctic air knifed through his layers. The snow had piled nearly 2 feet high since morning, and the darkness seemed absolute except for the faint glow from his cabin windows. Kieran grabbed his lantern and trudged toward the barn, each step requiring effort against the drifts. The barn doors were secured as he'd left them, but a strange feeling overtook him, an inexplicable certainty that something was different. Years on the frontier had taught him to trust such instincts. He drew his revolver, holding the lantern high with his other hand, and pushed open the door. Warm animal smells greeted him: hay, horses, and cattle. His small herd of 15 had been brought into the barn's protection before the storm hit. The horses nickered softly in recognition. Everything seemed in order, yet that feeling persisted. Kieran moved deeper into the barn, checking each stall methodically. When he reached the far corner where he stored extra hay, the lantern light fell across something unexpected, a splash of dark blue fabric against the golden straw. He raised the light higher and felt his heart stutter. Nestled within the hay bales was a young woman, curled tight against the cold despite the barn's relative warmth. Her skin was pale, with alarming hints of blue around her parted lips. Dark chestnut hair spilled in waves around a face striking even in unconsciousness. "Ma'am," Kieran called, holstering his weapon immediately. When she didn't stir, he set the lantern down and knelt beside her. Her clothing, a once fine blue wool dress, now travel-worn and damp from snow, suggested she wasn't from these parts. No local woman would be traveling alone in such weather. He touched her shoulder gently. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her skin felt like ice even through the fabric. When she didn't respond, Kieran's training took over. Hypothermia was a killer he'd encountered before. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her slender frame nearly lost within the folds of her dress. Up close, he could see she was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with delicate features and long eyelashes that rested against colorless cheeks. "Hold on," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "I've got you." The journey back to the cabin seemed interminable as he fought through deepening snow, cradling the unconscious woman against his chest. Questions circled his mind. Who was she? How had she found his remote property? What desperate circumstances would drive a young woman to seek shelter in a stranger's barn during the worst blizzard in years? The warmth of his cabin hit him like a physical force when he finally shouldered the door open. He laid her gently on his bed, the only proper place for her to recover. Up close in better light, he could see her skin held an unhealthy pallor beneath a natural cream complexion. Her chestnut hair, though tangled, framed a face of uncommon beauty. Kieran's medical knowledge was limited to frontier necessities, but he knew she needed warmth immediately. He stoked the fire until it roared, added another quilt from his trunk, and faced an uncomfortable realization. Her clothes were damp from snow and would only prolong the cold. "Forgive me, miss," he said quietly as he removed her boots and stockings. Her feet were alarmingly cold. He hesitated at the dress, his frontier practicality warring with propriety. In the end, survival won. He unfastened the sodden outer garments with averted eyes, leaving her in a simple cotton shift, and quickly covered her with every blanket he possessed. Next, he heated water and prepared a pot of strong coffee. When it was ready, he added a generous spoonful of honey, a rare luxury he saved for special occasions, and sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "Miss," he called again, lifting her head slightly. "I need you to drink this." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment he glimpsed eyes of striking hazel, more green than brown, before they closed again. It was enough encouragement. With gentle persistence, he coaxed several sips of the sweet, warm liquid into her. As color slowly returned to her face, Kieran found himself studying her with growing curiosity. She wore no wedding ring. Her hands, though elegant, showed signs of work, not the soft hands of a society woman. Around her neck hung a small silver locket, its chain disappearing beneath the blankets. "Where did you come from?" he wondered aloud. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the town nearly 20. No one traveled such distances in this weather unless running toward something or away from someone. The realization that she might be in trouble brought a frown to his face. Kieran had built his life around avoiding other people's problems. He hadn't fought in the war to come home and find more battles. The frontier was unforgiving enough without human complications. Yet he couldn't deny the protectiveness that had risen in him the moment he found her. It was an unwelcome feeling, a crack in the careful isolation he'd constructed. The woman stirred, her breathing growing stronger. Kieran moved away to give her space, settling into his chair across the room. The clock on the mantel showed nearly midnight when her eyes finally opened fully. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling, confusion evident in her expression. Then her gaze found him and she gasped, trying to sit up. "Easy," Kieran said, keeping his distance. "You're safe. I found you in my barn, half frozen." She looked around wildly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where am I? Who are you?" "My name's Kieran Keller. This is my ranch, about 20 miles northwest of Silver Creek." He kept his voice deliberately calm. "You were suffering from the cold. I brought you inside to warm up." Awareness seemed to flood back to her all at once. She clutched the blankets tighter, eyes widening as she realized her outer clothes were gone. "My dress. It was wet with snow. I removed only what was necessary and covered you immediately," Kieran explained, feeling heat rise to his face. "Forgiveness, miss, but you were near death from cold." She assessed him for a long moment, wariness warring with the reality of her situation. Finally she nodded once, acceptance if not trust. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm Delaney Evans." "Miss Evans," he inclined his head. "Can you tell me how you came to be in my barn in the middle of a blizzard?" She glanced toward the window, where snow still whipped past in the darkness. The stage was overturned about 5 miles back. The driver was killed instantly. Her voice faltered. "I was the only passenger. I tried to stay with the coach, but wolves came." I took one of the horses and rode until it collapsed from exhaustion. Then I walked, following fence lines when I could see them. Kieran frowned. The stage route didn't come within 10 miles of his property. She must have become disoriented in the storm. I saw your barn just as I thought I couldn't go any further, she continued. I'm sorry for trespassing. No need for apologies. No one should be turned away in weather like this. He stood and moved to the stove. Are you hungry? I have stew. She nodded, and he busied himself reheating the simple beef and potato stew he'd made earlier. When he returned with a steaming bowl, she had managed to sit up, though she kept the blankets pulled tight around her shoulders. Thank you, she said again, accepting the food. After a tentative first spoonful, hunger took over and she ate with the desperation of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Kieran returned to his chair, giving her privacy while she ate. Where were you headed, Miss Evans? He asked when she finally set the empty bowl aside. A shadow crossed her face. Helena, I have an uncle there. Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Kieran didn't press. Everyone on the frontier had secrets, his own included. You're welcome to stay until the storm passes, he offered. Then I can take you to Silver Creek. The stage comes through twice weekly. You're very kind, Mr. Keller, she said, though her expression remained guarded. I won't impose longer than necessary. The clock struck midnight, its chime filling the small cabin. Kieran stood, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. A young, unmarried woman alone with a bachelor in an isolated cabin would scandalize even the frontier's relaxed sensibilities. You should rest, he said, gathering blankets from the trunk. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. I couldn't take your bed. Please, I insist. He arranged his makeshift pallet without further discussion. There's water in the pitcher if you need it. Night clothes in the trunk might serve you. They were my mother's. She thanked him again, the wariness in her eyes softening slightly. As Kieran settled onto his blankets near the fire, he listened to the soft sounds of her breathing. It had been years since he'd shared his space with another person. The sensation was alien, not unpleasant, but disquieting in how quickly it disrupted his carefully constructed solitude. Mr. Keller, her voice came softly through the darkness. Yes, I believe you saved my life tonight. He stared at the dancing shadows on the ceiling. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said with quiet certainty, not anyone. Sleep claimed him before he could consider what she meant, but her words followed him into restless dreams. Morning arrived with blinding brightness as sunlight reflected off endless white. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a transformed landscape, drifts taller than a man, trees bowed under the weight of snow, and a silence that seemed to swallow all other sounds. Kieran woke with the sun, his body stiff from the hard floor. For a moment he thought he'd dreamed the previous night's events until he turned to see Delaney Evans sitting up in his bed, watching him with those remarkable hazel eyes. She wore one of his mother's old nightgowns, her chestnut hair loosely braided over one shoulder. In daylight, he could see she was even more striking than he'd realized. High cheekbones, a delicate nose, and full lips currently curved in an uncertain smile. Good morning, she said softly. Kieran nodded, suddenly conscious of his rumpled appearance. How are you feeling? Much improved, thanks to your kindness. She glanced toward the window. Though I see we won't be traveling anywhere soon. He followed her gaze. The snow had drifted against the cabin, nearly covering the lower half of the window. No, I'm afraid not. We're snowed in for at least a few days. A flicker of something, concern, fear, crossed her face before she smoothed her expression. I see. I need to check on the animals, Kieran said, rising. Make yourself at home. There's coffee and biscuits left from yesterday. He dressed quickly in his outdoor gear, grateful for the excuse to escape the unfamiliar intimacy of sharing his space with another person, especially one who unsettled him in ways he didn't care to examine. The cold air cleared his head as he trudged through snow toward the barn, following the path he'd broken the night before. Inside, the animals greeted him with familiar sounds. The normalcy was comforting as he set about his morning chores, feeding the horses and cattle, checking for any damage the storm might have caused, ensuring the water hadn't frozen. Physical labor had always centered him, allowed him to process his thoughts, and there was much to process. Delaney Evans presented a complication he hadn't anticipated. His instinct was to help her reach her destination and return to his solitude as quickly as possible. Yet something about her story nagged at him: the stage route's divergence from his property, her guarded responses, the lack of luggage. She was running from something, that much seemed certain. It wasn't his concern, he reminded himself firmly. The frontier was full of people fleeing their pasts. He'd help her reach Silver Creek once the snow allowed travel, and that would be the end of it. When Kieran returned to the cabin, he found Delaney dressed in one of his mother's old-day dresses, a simple blue cotton that had faded with age but still complemented her coloring. She'd managed to make coffee and was attempting to revive the fire. "Allow me," he said, setting down the bucket of milk he'd brought from the barn. He crouched before the hearth, adding kindling and logs until the flames strengthened. "Thank you," she smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "I'm afraid I'm not very practiced at frontier skills." "You survived a Montana blizzard alone," Kieran pointed out. "I'd say that demonstrates considerable skill." She glanced away, desperation perhaps. He didn't press the point, instead moving to the stove where he began preparing a proper breakfast: flapjacks with the fresh milk, strips of salt pork, and the last of his preserved apples. "May I help?" she asked, hovering nearby. Kieran hesitated only briefly before nodding. "You can slice the apples." They worked together in surprisingly comfortable silence. Kieran found himself stealing glances at her as she concentrated on her task, her slender fingers moving deftly despite their recent ordeal. She was perhaps 21 or 22, he decided, young, but with a gravity to her demeanor that suggested experience beyond her years. "Where are you from originally, Miss Evans?" he asked as they sat down to eat. "St. Louis," she replied after a slight pause. "My father was a merchant there." "Was? He passed last year." Her voice remained steady, but Kieran noticed how her fingers tightened around her fork. "Yellow fever. I'm sorry for your loss." She nodded, accepting his condolence with practiced grace. "And you, Mr. Keller, have you always lived in Montana territory?" "No," he spread honey on his flapjack. "Born in Pennsylvania. Came west after the war." "You fought?" "Union cavalry." He offered no further details, and she seemed to sense his reluctance to elaborate. "Your ranch is lovely," she said instead. "Though quite isolated." "That's by design." He met her gaze directly. "I prefer my own company." Delaney studied him with those perceptive eyes. "That explains why you live 20 miles from town, but not why you bothered to rescue a stranger from your barn." Kieran felt unexpectedly exposed by her observation. Even a man who values solitude doesn't leave another to freeze to death. Some would. Something in her tone suggested personal experience. Before he could question it, she continued, "You mentioned Silver Creek. What sort of town is it?" "Small but growing. Has the usual general store, smithy, saloon. Nearest doctors there too." "And law enforcement?" The question seemed casual, but Kieran noted how she held herself slightly too still, awaiting his answer. "Marshal Watson, decent man, fair-minded." Relief flickered across her features before she masked it. "That's good to know." They finished breakfast in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and wind whistling around the cabin's eaves. Afterward, Kieran cleared the dishes while Delaney insisted on washing them, her sleeves rolled to reveal slender wrists and forearms. "I should warn you," Kieran said as he pulled on his coat again, "we might be stuck here several days. The snow's nearly 4 feet deep in places." "I understand." She dried a plate with careful movements. "I'll try not to be a burden." "You're not," he said, surprising himself with his sincerity. "Just thought you should know." Outside, the work of digging paths to the necessary buildings occupied most of his morning. The physical exertion helped clear his mind, which kept circling back to his mysterious guest. By midday, he'd managed to create passable trails to the barn, woodshed, and outhouse. When he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots, the scene that greeted him stopped him short. Delaney was humming softly as she stirred something that smelled delicious on the stove. She'd swept the floor, straightened his few possessions, and even arranged a small bundle of pine branches in a jar as a makeshift decoration. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, hanging his coat by the door. She turned, a light flush coloring her cheeks. "I wanted to earn my keep. It's venison stew. I found the meat in your cold storage." "I hope that's all right." "It's fine." He moved closer, inhaling the rich aroma. "Smells good." "My father insisted I learn to cook, even though we had servants." A shadow crossed her face. "He said a woman should always be prepared for changing fortunes." "Wise man." "Yes," she stirred the pot again. "Though I suspect he never imagined I'd be testing those skills in a remote Montana cabin during a blizzard." Despite himself, Kieran smiled. "Life has a way of surprising us." Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them. A moment of shared understanding that made his heart beat faster than it had any right to. Kieran looked away first, busying himself with unnecessary adjustments to the fire. They ate lunch together, and Kieran had to admit her stew surpassed his own efforts considerably. As the short winter day began to wane, they settled into a strange domesticity. She mended a tear in one of his shirts while he cleaned his rifle, both occupied with their tasks yet increasingly aware of each other's presence. "Do you have family waiting for you in Helena?" Kieran asked eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. Delaney's hands stilled for a moment. "Just my uncle. I haven't seen him in many years." "He doesn't know you're coming." "I sent a letter." Her needle resumed its rhythm. "Whether he received it, I can't be certain." Kieran frowned. "Seems a long journey to make without assurances." "Sometimes necessity outweighs caution, Mr. Keller." She tied off her thread and bit it with her teeth. "I'm sure a frontier man like yourself understands that." He couldn't argue with her logic, though something about her explanation still felt incomplete. Before he could formulate another question, she changed the subject. "That book on your mantel, Whitman, isn't it? Are you a reader of poetry?" Kieran glanced at the worn volume. "It was my mother's. She used to read from it in the evenings." "Would you mind if I borrowed it? I've always found Whitman's words comforting." "Help yourself." She retrieved the book, handling it with a reverence that pleased him, and settled back in her chair. As she read silently, the firelight played across her features, softening them. For the first time since her arrival, she appeared truly relaxed. "Would you read aloud?" The request escaped him before he could reconsider it. Delaney looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "You'd like me to read to you?" Kieran nodded, somewhat embarrassed but unwilling to retract the request. "If you don't mind." "Of course." She smiled softly and turned a few pages. "Song of the Open Road," a fitting choice for two travelers, wouldn't you say? Her voice, when she began reading, was clear and melodious, not the affected tones of a society woman, but something more genuine. The words flowed around them, filling the cabin with images of freedom, possibility, and the endless horizon. Kieran closed his eyes, letting himself be transported by Whitman's vision and Delaney's voice. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself such simple pleasure? Years, certainly. The war had stolen more than lives, it had taken his belief in beauty in connection. "The earth is rude, silent, incomprehensible at first," she read. "Nature is rude and incomprehensible at first. Be not discouraged. Keep on. There are divine things well enveloped. I swear to you there are divine things more beautiful than words can tell." When she finished the poem, silence settled between them. Not the awkward silence of strangers, but something deeper, more meaningful. "Thank you," Kieran said finally. Delaney closed the book gently. "My father used to say poetry is how the soul speaks when ordinary words fail." Another wise observation. He had many. Her smile turned sad. "Though I sometimes wonder if he followed his own advice." Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and sending occasional drafts through the cabin despite Kieran's best efforts at weatherproofing. Delaney shivered slightly. Cold, he asked, a little. Without thinking, he removed the heavy wool blanket from the back of his chair and crossed to drape it around her shoulders. As he did, his fingers brushed against the warmth of her neck, and he felt her slight intake of breath. Their eyes met, and for one suspended moment, Kieran forgot why isolation had seemed so necessary. Then reality reasserted itself, and he stepped back, clearing his throat. "It's getting late," he said. "You should take the bed again." "I can't keep displacing you," she protested. "At least let me sleep by the fire tonight." "The floor's no place for a lady," Kieran insisted. "I'm used to rough conditions." Delaney seemed about to argue further, but instead she nodded. "You're very kind, Mr. Keller." "Kieran," he said impulsively, "if we're to be snowed in together, you might as well use my given name." Her smile brightened. "Then you must call me Delaney." The simple exchange felt more intimate than it should have. As they prepared for sleep, Kieran found himself hyper-aware of her movements, the soft sounds of her breathing, the faint floral scent that somehow clung to her despite her ordeal. That night, as he lay again on his makeshift bed near the fire, listening to the storm's renewed fury outside, Kieran acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Delaney Evans had breached his defenses more in 24 hours than anyone had in the past 3 years. More troubling still was the realization that some part of him welcomed it. "Dangerous thinking," he murmured to himself as sleep finally claimed him. "She'll be gone when the snow clears." But in his dreams she stayed. The next morning dawned bright but no less snow-covered. If anything, the drifts had grown higher overnight. Kieran estimated they had at least 3 more days before travel would be possible, perhaps longer if another storm moved in. He found Delaney already awake, dressed in another of his mother's old dresses, her hair neatly braided and pinned. She had coffee waiting and was attempting to make biscuits, her forehead creased in concentration as she measured flour. "You're up early," he observed. She glanced up with a smile that did strange things to his chest. "I wanted to be useful." "I hope I didn't wake you." "No," he accepted the coffee she offered, "but you don't need to wait on me." "I'm not waiting on you," she countered. "I'm simply trying to earn my keep, as I said." Kieran wanted to tell her she owed him nothing for basic human decency, but something told him her pride needed this small assertion of independence. Instead, he nodded, "Fair enough." After breakfast, which featured surprisingly good biscuits despite her apparent inexperience, Kieran faced the day's necessary tasks. The animals needed tending, paths required clearing as new snow had fallen, and he needed to check his fence lines for damage. "I'll be gone most of the day," he told her as he pulled on his coat. "Will you be all right alone?" Delaney looked momentarily alarmed before composing herself. "Of course. Is there anything I can do while you're gone?" He considered. "There's mending if you're inclined. Firewood needs stacking by the hearth. Otherwise, rest, you're still recovering." "I'll find ways to be useful," she assured him. Kieran hesitated at the door. "If anyone comes, which is unlikely in this weather, stay inside. Most folks around here are decent, but a woman alone should be cautious," she finished for him. "I understand." He nodded, oddly reluctant to leave despite the work awaiting him. "I'll be back before dark." The day proved longer and harder than he'd anticipated. One section of fence had collapsed completely under the weight of snow, requiring temporary repairs. 2 calves had somehow escaped their pen within the barn and needed to be corralled. By the time he'd finished his rounds, the sun was already dipping toward the western mountains. Tired and cold, Kieran trudged back to the cabin. The sight that greeted him through the window stopped him in his tracks. Delaney moved about the small space with a grace that seemed to transform it. She'd arranged his few possessions more attractively, hung his spare shirts after pressing them, and appeared to be cooking something that filled the cabin with an enticing aroma. For a moment he simply watched her, this unexpected whirlwind who'd blown into his life. She hummed as she worked, occasionally pausing to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The domesticity of the scene affected him more profoundly than it should have. When he finally entered, stamping snow from his boots, she turned with a smile that warmed him more effectively than the fire. "You're back." I was beginning to worry. "Fence trouble," he explained, hanging his coat. "Something smells good." "Rabbit stew," she said. "I found 2 in your snares when I brought in more firewood. I hope that's all right." Kieran blinked in surprise. "You checked the snares." "The paths you cleared made it easy enough." She stirred the pot. "I grew up watching our cook prepare game. It wasn't so different doing it myself." He found himself impressed by her initiative. Most city women would have waited helplessly for his return rather than venture out and dress wild game themselves. "Thank you," he said simply. Delaney shrugged, though her pleased expression betrayed her. "It passes the time." As they ate together, Kieran found himself relaxing for the first time in recent memory. The stew was excellent, seasoned with herbs she'd found dried in his kitchen stores. More remarkable was the conversation that flowed between them, about books they'd read, places they'd seen, observations about life that revealed compatible perspectives despite their different backgrounds. "How did you end up ranching in Montana?" she asked as they finished their meal. "You mentioned Pennsylvania, but that's quite a journey." Kieran hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his past, yet something about Delaney's attentive gaze made the words come easier than expected. "After the war, I couldn't go back, too many ghosts." He stared into his coffee. "Worked my way west, cowhand in Kansas, scout in Colorado, gold mining in Idaho. None of it felt right until I came here 3 years ago." "And you found peace here?" Her question held no judgment, only genuine interest. "Found something like it." He met her eyes. "The mountains don't ask questions. The seasons change whether you're happy or miserable. There's honesty in that." Delaney nodded slowly. "I understand the appeal of starting fresh somewhere nature still rules, though I imagine it gets lonely." "Loneliness is preferable to some alternatives." The words came out more bitterly than he'd intended. "Such as?" Kieran considered deflecting but found himself answering honestly. "Disappointment, betrayal, loss." "Those are indeed painful," she acknowledged quietly. "But is avoiding them worth missing everything else life offers?" The question hung between them, uncomfortably insightful. Kieran stood and moved to add wood to the fire, using the activity to gather his thoughts. "Sometimes it's not a choice," he said finally. "Sometimes circumstances make the decision for you." Delaney studied him with those perceptive hazel eyes. "You lost someone during the war, didn't you?" The direct question caught him off guard. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk about ghosts, the determination in your isolation." Her voice softened. "The sadness that comes into your eyes when you think no one's watching." Kieran felt exposed, as though she'd peered directly into the carefully locked chambers of his heart. For a moment, he considered shutting down the conversation entirely. It would be easy enough to claim tiredness or find some task that needed immediate attention. Instead, he found himself speaking words he hadn't uttered to another soul. "My brother, he was 19, followed me into the cavalry despite my objections." The familiar ache spread through his chest. "Took a Confederate bullet at Gettysburg that was meant for me." "I'm so sorry, Kieran." "After that, I couldn't face our parents, couldn't return to our hometown where everyone knew us as the Keller boys." He stared into the flames. "So I kept moving west, thinking each new place might let me outrun the guilt." "And did it work?" she asked gently. He gave a humorless laugh. "What do you think?" "I think guilt is a poor reason to deny yourself human connection." Delaney's words were soft but direct. "Your brother wouldn't have wanted that for you." "You didn't know him," Kieran said, more sharply than he intended. "No," she agreed, unfazed by his tone, "but I know something about survivor's guilt. My mother and sister died in the same fever that eventually took my father. I was the only one who never fell ill." The revelation surprised him. "I'm sorry." She nodded, accepting his condolence. "For months afterward, I couldn't understand why I'd been spared. What made me deserving of life when they weren't? I nearly drove myself mad with the question." What changed? I realized I was dishonoring their memory by refusing to live fully. Her gaze held his steadily. They would have given anything for more time. Using mine to hide away would have been the real betrayal. The words struck Kieran with unexpected force. Had he been betraying Kyle all these years by retreating from life rather than embracing it? The thought was too unsettling to examine closely. It's different, he said finally. Delaney didn't argue, but the gentle skepticism in her eyes told him she disagreed. Instead of pressing the point, she changed the subject. I found a chessboard while organizing today. Do you play? Grateful for the shift in conversation, Kieran nodded. My father taught me, though it's been years. Would you care for a game? She was already retrieving the small wooden set from the shelf where she'd placed it. I warn you, I'm quite good. The confidence in her declaration brought a genuine smile to his face. Is that so? We'll see about that. They set up the board on the small table between them, and for the next 2 hours, Kieran forgot his guilt, his isolation, and the storm that raged outside. Delaney proved to be exactly as skilled as she'd claimed, playing with a strategic mind that challenged him fully. They were evenly matched, each winning 2 games before fatigue finally overcame them both. As they prepared for sleep, Kieran found himself strangely reluctant for the day to end. Delaney seemed to share the sentiment, lingering over small tasks and continuing their conversation until the clock struck midnight. We should rest, he said finally, arranging his blankets by the fire. She nodded, already seated on the edge of his bed. Kieran. Yes. Thank you for sharing about your brother. I know it wasn't easy. He met her gaze across the dimly lit cabin. Thank you for listening. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that boundaries had shifted, that they were no longer merely strangers thrown together by circumstance, but something closer to friends. That night, for the first time in years, Kieran dreamed of Kyle without waking in cold sweat. Instead, he dreamed of his brother laughing, pointing toward something in the distance that Kieran couldn't yet see but felt compelled to seek. The third day of their snowbound coexistence dawned with subtle changes in the weather. The temperature had risen slightly, and the wind had died down. Kieran knew from experience these were the first signs of a thaw, though it would be days yet before travel became feasible. He found himself strangely ambivalent about this development. Logic told him Delaney needed to continue her journey, that his life would return to normal once she departed. Yet some treacherous part of him had grown accustomed to her presence, her smile when he returned from outside chores, her voice reading Whitman in the evenings, the way she'd unconsciously hum while cooking. The snow's starting to settle, he told her over breakfast. Another few days and the paths to town should be clear enough for the sleigh. Oh, she looked down at her plate. That's good news. You'll be able to continue to Helena soon. Delaney nodded, though he noted she didn't meet his eyes. Yes, of course. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Kieran busied himself with preparations for his daily chores, gathering his tools with more concentration than the task required. Is there anything I can do today? Delaney asked as he prepared to leave. More mending or cooking? Nothing comes to mind, he answered. You've already done more than necessary. It doesn't feel like enough, she said quietly. You've given me shelter, food, your bed. I wish I could repay your kindness somehow. Kieran turned to face her fully. You don't owe me anything, Delaney. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, her eyes held his. Most men finding a strange woman in their barn would have been far less honorable. The implication made him uncomfortable, though he recognized its truth. Well, I'm not most men. No, she agreed with a small smile. You certainly are not. Something in her tone made his heart beat faster. He cleared his throat. I should get to work. The cattle need attending. Outside, the crisp air cleared his head. Kieran went about his chores methodically, trying to focus on the present rather than the inevitable departure that loomed in the coming days. He'd known from the beginning that Delaney's presence was temporary. Why then did the thought of her leaving create such an ache in his chest? She's not for you, he muttered to himself as he repaired a stall door. She has her own life, her own plans. Your paths crossed by accident, nothing more. Yet his treacherous mind kept returning to the comfort of her presence, the ease of their conversations, the way she looked at him as though truly seeing him. Few people in his life had ever done that, looked beyond his taciturn exterior to the man beneath. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the western horizon, promising more snow by nightfall. Kieran finished his work quickly and headed back to the cabin, wanting to secure everything before the next storm hit. He found Delaney standing on the porch, wrapped in his mother's old shawl, watching the approaching weather with a frown. More snow coming, she observed as he approached. Kieran nodded, joining her on the porch. Won't be as bad as the last storm, just enough to delay travel another day or two. I see, she continued, staring at the distant clouds. Standing beside her, Kieran was acutely aware of their proximity. The way her shoulder nearly touched his arm, the scent of pine soap in her hair, the small puffs of breath visible in the cold air. An impulse to reach for her hand nearly overwhelmed him. Instead, he asked, "Are you eager to reach Helena?" Delaney hesitated. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to go there." "That doesn't answer my question." She turned to face him, her expression complicated. "I'm not eager to leave here if that's what you're asking." The admission hung between them, charged with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Kieran found himself at a loss for words, caught between hope and caution. The first snowflakes began to fall, delicate and sparse. "We should go inside," he said finally. Delaney nodded, but as she turned to enter the cabin, she stumbled slightly on the threshold. Kieran reached out instinctively, his hand catching her elbow to steady her. The contact, though brief, sent warmth spreading through him despite the cold. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes meeting his. For one suspended moment they stood perfectly still, connected by his hand on her arm and something deeper than physical touch. Then Kieran released her, stepping back to a safer distance. "Careful," he said unnecessarily, "the boards can be slippery." Inside, they moved through their now familiar evening routine. Kieran built up the fire while Delaney prepared a simple supper from their dwindling supplies. They ate together at the small table, their conversation meandering through topics both meaningful and mundane. As darkness fell and the snow intensified outside, Delaney retrieved the Whitman book from the shelf where she'd placed it. Without being asked, she began to read aloud, her voice filling the cabin with words of connection and possibility. "This is what you shall do," she read. "Love the earth and sun and the animals, despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks, stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your income and labor to others, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God." Kieran watched her as she read, the firelight playing across her features. Something fundamental was shifting within him. Walls he'd built years ago were crumbling. Beliefs about solitude and safety were being challenged by her very existence. When she finished reading, she looked up to find him studying her intently. "Why are you looking at me that way?" she asked softly. Kieran considered deflecting but found himself answering honestly. "I'm trying to understand how someone I've known only 3 days can make me question everything I've believed for years." A flush spread across her cheeks. "What have I made you question?" "Whether isolation is really safer than connection, whether the frontier demands solitude or simply allows it." He hesitated. "Whether I've been hiding rather than healing." Delaney closed the book gently. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "None yet," he admitted, "except that I'm not ready for you to leave." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Delaney's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "I'm not ready to go," she whispered. The confession, so simply stated, broke something open between them. Kieran moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. They were small but strong, workers' hands despite her refined background. "I don't know what this is," he said honestly. "I don't know where it leads or if it can lead anywhere at all. But I know that meeting you has awakened something I thought was dead." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Kieran." "You don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just needed you to know before." "Before I leave," she finished for him. One tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said from the beginning." A flicker of apprehension passed through him. "What is it?" Delaney took a deep breath. "I wasn't entirely truthful about why I'm traveling to Helena." Kieran waited, his hand still holding hers, though he felt a growing tension in his shoulders. "I do have an uncle there," she continued, "but my primary reason for leaving St. Louis was, I was being forced into a marriage I didn't want." "Forced?" "After my father died, his business partner, Mr. Harlan, proposed to me. He's nearly 50, with a reputation for cruelty to his previous wife." Her voice remained steady despite the obvious distress in her eyes. "When I refused, he revealed that my father had incurred significant debts to him. He offered to forgive them in exchange for my hand." Anger stirred in Kieran's chest. "That's coercion, not courtship." "Yes, when I still refused, he became insistent. Threatened to have me declared mentally unfit, claimed my father had promised me to him in a verbal agreement." She looked down at their joined hands. "I had no proof to the contrary, no witnesses to defend me. As a woman alone, my options were limited." "So you ran," Kieran concluded. Delaney nodded. "I took what money remained from my father's estate and fled. Mr. Harlan has connections throughout the Midwest, so I needed to go far, somewhere he wouldn't think to look." "Montana Territory," Kieran murmured. "My uncle is my only living relative. I wrote to him before leaving but had no time to wait for a reply." She finally looked up, her expression vulnerable. "I understand if this changes how you see me, an unmarried woman fleeing a respectable proposal, possibly with a man pursuing her." "It changes nothing," Kieran said firmly. "Except perhaps my admiration for your courage." Relief flooded her features. "You believe me?" "Of course I believe you." He reached up to gently brush away another tear that had escaped. "No woman travels alone in a Montana winter, without compelling reasons." "I've been so afraid," she admitted. "Not just of Mr. Harlan finding me, but of what people would think, that I'm immoral or unstable or fortune-hunting." "None of those things are true," Kieran assured her. "You're the most principled person I've met in years." Delaney's smile was tremulous but genuine. "Thank you for saying that." Without thinking, Kieran raised one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was an old-fashioned gesture his father had often shown his mother, one he'd never imagined himself performing. "You're safe here," he promised, "for as long as you need to be." Their eyes held and something shifted between them, a barrier lowered, a possibility acknowledged. Kieran became acutely aware of their proximity, of the softness of her skin beneath his fingers, of her slightly parted lips. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, breaking the spell. Kieran released her hands and stood, creating distance between them, though it was the last thing he wanted. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We should rest." Delaney nodded, though disappointment flickered briefly in her eyes. "Of course." That night, as Kieran lay on his makeshift bed near the fire, sleep proved elusive. His mind circled through everything Delaney had revealed: her flight from forced marriage, her courage in facing the frontier alone, her admission that she wasn't ready to leave. What did it mean for him, for them? He'd built his life around independence, convinced himself that solitude was preferable to vulnerability. Yet in just a few days, this remarkable woman had made him question certainties he'd held for years. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily, buying them time before decisions must be made. In the dark cabin, with only the crackling fire for company, Kieran allowed himself to imagine possibilities he'd long since abandoned: a life not defined by isolation, a future that included connection. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating. Across the room he could hear Delaney's soft, even breathing. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight she was safe. Tonight she was here. For now, that would have to be enough. The storm passed by morning, leaving another 6 inches of fresh snow blanketing the landscape. Kieran rose early, performing his daily chores with unusual energy despite his restless night. The work gave him time to think, to process the revelations and emotions of the previous evening. By the time he returned to the cabin for lunch, he'd reached certain conclusions. He found Delaney preparing a meal from their dwindling supplies, humming softly as she worked. "I need to ride into town tomorrow," he announced after they'd eaten. "We're running low on provisions, and I should check if the stage is running yet." Delaney looked up sharply. "You're taking me to town." "No," he said carefully. "I'm going alone. The trail will be treacherous, better for one rider than two. Besides, it might be safer for you to stay here, given what you told me last night." Relief visibly washed over her. "You're right, of course. Thank you for considering that." "While I'm there, I could inquire about your uncle in Helena," Kieran offered. "Marshal Watson might know of him or how to get a message to him." "That would be kind," she said. "His name is Edward Evans. He was a surveyor for the railroad last I heard." Kieran nodded, memorizing the name. "Is there anything specific you need from town?" Delaney hesitated. "Perhaps some proper clothes. These dresses of your mother's are lovely, but—" Of course, he felt foolish for not considering it earlier. "I'll speak to Mrs. Miller at the general store. She's discreet and fair-minded." "Thank you," she smiled, then added hesitantly, "Kieran, about last night." "You don't need to explain further," he assured her. "Your secrets are safe with me." "It's not that," her cheeks colored slightly. "I wanted to say that I meant what I said about not being ready to leave." Kieran's heart quickened. "I meant what I said too." Their eyes met across the small table, and the connection between them seemed to strengthen, to solidify into something tangible. Neither spoke for a long moment, letting the acknowledgement settle between them. Finally, Kieran cleared his throat. "I should prepare for tomorrow's ride. It'll be a long day." The afternoon passed in practical preparations. Kieran checked his saddle and tack, cleaned his revolver, and plotted the safest route to town given the snow conditions. Delaney busied herself taking inventory of their supplies and writing a detailed list of necessities. As evening approached, they settled into what had become their comfortable routine: a simple dinner, conversation by the fire, and Delaney reading aloud from Whitman. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm ran an undercurrent of anticipation, of unspoken possibilities. "Be careful tomorrow," Delaney said as they prepared for sleep. "The trail must be dangerous after so much snow." "I've made the journey in worse conditions," Kieran assured her, though he appreciated her concern. "I'll be back before dark." She nodded, but worry remained in her eyes. "I'll pray for your safe return." The simple statement touched him more than he expected. "Thank you." That night sleep came easier despite the journey ahead. Somewhere during these snowbound days, Kieran realized, his cabin had transformed from a refuge of isolation to something warmer, something that felt strangely like home. The difference, he knew, was entirely due to Delaney's presence. Morning brought clear skies and temperatures cold enough to create a crust on the snow, ideal conditions for travel. Kieran dressed in his warmest clothing, packed provisions for the journey, and checked his weapons one final time. "I'll be back by sunset," he promised as he prepared to leave. "Keep the doors locked. No one should come by, but if they do—" "Don't open the door," Delaney finished for him. "I'll be fine, Kieran. I've survived worse than a day alone in a warm cabin." Her confidence reassured him, though a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years made leaving her difficult. "There's coffee and biscuits left from breakfast, wood stacked by the fire. My spare revolver is in the drawer by the bed, if you need it." She stepped closer, adjusting his scarf with careful hands. "I'll be waiting for you." The simple promise settled something in his chest. On impulse, he reached out to touch her cheek gently. "I know you will." For a heartbeat, he thought about kissing her, wanted to kiss her, but caution held him back. There would be time for that conversation when he returned. Instead, he let his hand fall away and stepped back. "Until tonight," he said. The journey to Silver Creek proved every bit as challenging as Kieran had anticipated. Though the main trail had been partially broken by other travelers, long stretches required careful navigation through deep drifts. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, handled the conditions admirably, but progress was slow. By midday, the cluster of buildings that comprised Silver Creek came into view, the general store, saloon, smithy, and scattered houses that served the surrounding ranches and farms. Kieran headed first to the livery stable, where he arranged for Buck to be fed and warmed while he conducted his business. The general store was his next stop. Its proprietor, Harold Miller, greeted him with surprise. "Keller. Didn't expect to see anyone from your direction after that blizzard. You must be running mighty low on supplies to risk the trails." "Low enough," Kieran agreed, handing over his list. "How soon before the stage starts running again?" "Day after tomorrow, weather permitting." Miller began gathering the requested items. "Had a nasty accident just before the worst of the storm hit. Driver killed, coach overturned about 5 miles north of the crossing." Kieran kept his expression neutral despite the confirmation of Delaney's story. "Any passengers?" "That's the strange thing, coach was empty when they found it. Driver's body was there, poor soul, but no sign of whoever might have been riding. Company records showed 1 ticket sold from Butte, but no name recorded." Miller shook his head. "Marshall organized a search party once the weather cleared some, but nothing so far." "Wolves in that area," Kieran observed, maintaining his casual tone. "Might explain why no bodies were found." Miller crossed himself. Lord help anyone caught out in that storm. As the storekeeper assembled his order, Kieran approached Mrs. Miller, who managed the dry goods section. He explained he needed women's clothing, presenting the fiction of a young cousin arriving unexpectedly, and provided Delaney's approximate measurements. The woman asked few questions, selecting practical items appropriate for frontier life. With that task completed, Kieran made his way to the marshal's office. He found Watson at his desk, reviewing wanted posters and correspondence that had accumulated during the storm. "Keller," the lawman greeted him with a nod. "Surprised to see you in town so soon after that blizzard." "Needed supplies," Kieran explained, settling into the chair across from the desk. "Heard about the stage accident. Any more news on that?" Marshal Watson sighed. "Nothing good. Still haven't found any sign of the passenger. At this point, we're assuming the worst." "Shame," Kieran said noncommittally. "Say, I was wondering if you've heard of a man named Edward Evans. Surveyor, supposedly working near Helena." The marshal frowned. "Evans, name doesn't ring a bell, why do you ask?" "Heard he might be buying cattle in the spring. Thought I might write to him, see if he's interested in my stock." "I can ask around," Watson offered. "The telegraph line to Helena is down from the storm, but should be repaired within the week." "I'd appreciate that." Their conversation shifted to local matters. Reports of rustlers operating near the territorial border, updates on families who might need assistance after the storm, the usual business of frontier communities. Throughout, Kieran listened for any mention of a man seeking a young woman, any word of someone named Harlan making inquiries. He heard nothing concerning, which both relieved and puzzled him. If Delaney's story was true, and he believed it was, wouldn't her spurned suitor have initiated some search? Perhaps news of her disappearance hadn't reached this far west yet, or perhaps Harlan assumed she'd fled in another direction entirely. After completing his business with the marshal, Kieran visited the saloon briefly, not for drink but for information. Saloons were the nervous system of frontier towns, places where news and rumors circulated freely. He nursed a single whiskey, listening more than talking, gathering what intelligence he could about conditions throughout the territory. By mid-afternoon, he'd concluded his business and collected his purchases: food staples, ammunition, the clothing for Delaney, and a few small luxuries he thought might please her. With Buck rested and the supplies secured, he began the journey home, aware that daylight was limited and the trails would be dangerous after dark. The return trip proved even more challenging as the afternoon sun had softened the snow, making it heavier and more treacherous. Buck struggled in places, forcing Kieran to dismount and lead the animal through the worst sections. Darkness was falling when the cabin finally came into view, a welcome sight with lamplight glowing in the windows. As he approached, the door flew open, and Delaney appeared on the porch, her silhouette outlined against the warm light behind her. The relief on her face when she spotted him sent an unexpected surge of emotion through his chest. "You're back," she called, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "I was getting worried." "Trail was worse than expected," he explained as he dismounted stiffly. "Need to see to Buck first. He's had a hard day." "I'll help," she offered, already moving toward them. Together, they led the exhausted horse to the barn, removed his tack, and rubbed him down. Delaney worked alongside Kieran with surprising competence, anticipating needs before he voiced them. When Buck was finally settled with fresh hay and water, they gathered the supplies and headed for the cabin. Inside, Kieran was greeted by unexpected comforts. A hot meal keeping warm on the stove, fresh coffee ready to pour, and the cabin itself tidier than he'd ever kept it. Most surprising was a rough wreath of evergreen boughs hanging over the fireplace, bringing the scent of pine indoors. "You've been busy," he observed, removing his snow-covered coat. Delaney shrugged, though pleasure at his notice was evident in her expression. "It helped pass the time while you were gone, kept my mind from worrying." "You were worried?" he asked as he sank gratefully into a chair by the fire. "Of course I was." She poured him coffee, adding honey the way she'd noticed he preferred it. "The trails are dangerous, and you were gone so long." The concern in her voice warmed something within him. How long had it been since anyone had worried about his safe return? Years, certainly. "I'm here now," he said simply, accepting the coffee from her hands. As they unpacked the supplies, Kieran shared what he'd learned in town, the confirmation of the stage accident, the search parties that had found no trace of passengers, the downed telegraph lines to Helena. "No one's looking for you specifically," he concluded, "at least not that I could determine." Relief washed over Delaney's features. "That's good news. It means Mr. Harlan hasn't traced me this far west yet. The marshal did say he hadn't heard of your uncle, but he promised to inquire once communications with Helena are restored." She nodded, though Kieran noticed a flicker of something, concern. Disappointment crossed her face. Before he could question it, her expression brightened as she discovered the package of clothing he'd purchased. "Oh, Kieran," she breathed, examining the practical but well-made dresses, undergarments, and warm stockings. "These are perfect. How did you know what to choose?" "Mrs. Miller helped," he admitted. "I hope they fit properly." "I'm sure they will." Her fingers traced the simple blue calico of one dress. "This was incredibly thoughtful, thank you." As they ate the meal she'd prepared, a surprisingly flavorful stew made from the last of their meat and vegetables, Kieran found himself studying Delaney with new eyes. Today's separation, brief though it was, had clarified something important. He didn't want to return to his solitary existence. The thought of this cabin without her presence had become almost unbearable. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching his gaze across the table. "You're looking at me strangely." Kieran considered deflecting but chose honesty instead. "I'm thinking that I missed you today. That coming back to find you here felt right in a way I can't fully explain." Color rose in her cheeks. "I missed you too. The cabin felt empty without you." "Delaney," he began, then hesitated, uncertain how to proceed. "Yes," her eyes held his, a mixture of hope and trepidation in their hazel depths. "The stage will be running again day after tomorrow," he said finally. "You could continue to Helena then if that's still your wish." She set down her fork slowly. "Is that what you want me to do?" The direct question demanded an equally direct answer. Kieran took a deep breath. "No," he said simply, "that's not what I want." "What do you want, Kieran?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to stay." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. "Not just until the snow melts or the stage runs. I want you to stay with me." Delaney's eyes widened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know it's sudden," he went on, the words coming faster now that he'd begun. "I know we've known each other less than a week. I know the proper thing would be to court you formally, to give you time to consider. But the truth is, finding you in that barn was the best thing that's happened to me in years. Kieran, let me finish, please. He reached across the table to take her hand. Before you came, I thought I'd made peace with solitude. I told myself the frontier demanded it, that connection was a luxury I couldn't afford. But you've shown me how empty that belief was. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't look away. I'm not asking for promises, he continued. I understand you came west with your own plans, your own hopes. All I'm asking is for you to consider staying, not as a guest or a refugee, but as someone who might want to build something here, with me. When he finished, silence stretched between them. Delaney looked down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. Kieran waited, his heart pounding in his chest. When I left St. Louis, she said finally, I was running away from something. I had no real destination in mind, only escape. She looked up, meeting his gaze. My uncle in Helena, he exists, but we've never been close. I didn't even know if he would welcome me. And now, Kieran asked quietly, now I find myself wanting to run toward something instead. Her fingers tightened around his. These past days with you have shown me possibilities I never considered, a life defined not by what I'm fleeing, but by what I'm choosing. Hope bloomed in Kieran's chest. Does that mean? It means I want to stay, she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because being here with you feels right in a way nothing ever has before. The simple declaration washed over him like sunlight after endless winter. Without conscious thought, Kieran rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. They stood facing each other, the small table no longer between them. I should court you properly, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You deserve that. Delaney smiled, reaching up to touch his face gently. I think we've moved beyond conventional courtship, don't you? After all, I've been sleeping in your bed for nearly a week. The teasing observation surprised a laugh from him, when you put it that way. Besides, she continued, her expression growing serious, we've shared more truth in these snowed-in days than most couples manage in months of formal courtship. Kieran couldn't argue with her logic. Something about their forced proximity, the isolation of the cabin during the storm, had accelerated the normal process of getting to know each other. He felt he understood Delaney's character, her strengths and vulnerabilities, in ways that went beyond superficial attraction. There would be challenges, he warned, needing her to understand the reality of what she was choosing. Life out here isn't easy, especially for a woman accustomed to city comforts. Do I strike you as someone who shrinks from challenges? She asked, arching an eyebrow. I survived a blizzard alone, found your barn through sheer determination, and adapted to frontier life without complaint. I'm stronger than I look, Kieran Keller. I don't doubt that for a moment, he assured her, his admiration evident. But this isn't a decision to make lightly, if you stay. If I stay, she interrupted gently, it would be as what exactly? Your housekeeper, your friend, your... The unspoken question hung between them. Kieran took a deep breath, knowing his answer would change everything. My wife, he said with quiet certainty, if you'll have me. Delaney's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if to verify his sincerity. Are you asking me to marry you, Kieran? She whispered. Yes. Now that he'd voiced it, the rightness of it settled in his chest. Not immediately, we can take time, get to know each other better first. But yes, Delaney Evans, I'm asking you to be my wife. Tears spilled onto her cheeks, but she was smiling, a radiant, joyful smile that transformed her entire face. Then my answer is yes. Yes, I will stay, and yes, I will marry you. The world seemed to still around them, this moment of commitment crystallizing into something precious and perfect. Kieran's hands trembled slightly as he reached up to cup her face, thumbs gently brushing away her tears. May I kiss you? He asked softly. In answer, Delaney rose on tiptoes, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a first kiss that was tender and reverent, a sealing of promises made. Kieran's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more needful. When they finally parted, both breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Never thought I would want this again." "Nor did I," she admitted, "when I fled St. Louis I thought only of escape, of safety. I never imagined finding a home, finding love at the end of my journey." The word love hung between them, neither having voiced it directly until now. Kieran pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "I do love you, Delaney," he said, the declaration feeling both monumental and perfectly natural. "I know it's happened quickly, but I love you with a certainty I've never felt before." "I love you too," she replied without hesitation. "Perhaps I began falling in love the moment I opened my eyes to find you'd rescued me from the cold." Outside, snow had begun falling again, gentle flakes drifting past the window, adding to the sense of isolation, of a world that contained only the two of them. Kieran led Delaney to the chairs before the fire, unwilling to let go of her hand even for a moment. They sat together, planning their future in quiet voices, how they would announce their engagement in Silver Creek, the improvements needed to make the cabin more comfortable, the spring planting that would expand his modest ranch into a true homestead. Each suggestion, each shared vision, strengthened the bond forming between them. "We should still contact your uncle," Kieran said as the evening grew late. "Let him know you're safe and spoken for." Delaney nodded, though he noticed a flicker of hesitation cross her face. "Yes, of course, though I doubt he's concerned about my whereabouts. We've exchanged perhaps 3 letters in my entire life." "Still it's proper," Kieran insisted. "And if this Harlan fellow comes looking, having family who can vouch for your choices might be important." "You're right," she smiled, squeezing his hand, "always thinking of practical matters." "Someone has to," he teased. "Especially if I'm marrying a woman who makes decorations from pine boughs when there's work to be done." She laughed, the sound filling the cabin with warmth. "That wreath took all of 10 minutes to make. Besides, don't pretend you don't like it." "I do like it," he admitted. "I like everything you've brought into this place. Light, laughter, life." The simple truth silenced them both for a moment. Delaney's eyes glistened with renewed emotion. "When I was freezing in that barn," she said quietly, "I thought I might die there, alone and unmoored from everything I'd ever known. Instead, I found you, a man who offered not just shelter for my body but sanctuary for my heart." Kieran brought her hand to his lips. "And you gave me back a future I thought I'd forfeited long ago." As the fire burned low and midnight approached, they reluctantly prepared for sleep. Though their commitment to each other was now spoken and returned, Kieran insisted on maintaining propriety until they could be properly married. "I'll still take the floor," he said firmly, despite Delaney's protests. "We'll do this right." "And when will that be?" she asked, "the doing it right part." Kieran considered. "As soon as the preacher can reach Silver Creek, likely within the week, weather permitting. Unless you want to wait longer." She shook her head decisively. "I've had enough of waiting. A small ceremony as soon as possible is all I desire." "Then that's what we'll have," he promised. That night as they lay in their separate beds, she on the mattress, he on his pallet near the fire, Kieran found himself filled with a contentment he'd never expected to experience again. The cabin that had once been merely shelter now felt like a home. The future that had once seemed predetermined, solitary, safe but empty, now stretched before him filled with possibilities. "Kieran," Delaney's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for finding me in that barn." He smiled into the dimness. "Thank you for freezing in it." Her soft laughter followed him into dreams that for once held no shadows, only light and promise, and the certainty of love found in the most unexpected of places. The following week passed in a blur of preparations, both practical and emotional. As soon as the trails were passable, Kieran rode into Silver Creek to announce their engagement and arrange for the circuit preacher's visit. The news spread quickly through the small community, generating both surprise and goodwill. Few had ever expected the solitary Kieran Keller to take a wife, especially so suddenly, but frontier life bred acceptance of unconventional courtships. Delaney, meanwhile, transformed the cabin with remarkable efficiency. Using the supplies Kieran had purchased and her own ingenuity, she created a home from what had been merely shelter. Curtains appeared at the windows, fashioned from fabric remnants Mrs. Miller had included with her new clothes. The single room was rearranged to create distinct areas for cooking, dining, and living. Small touches, a vase of dried grasses on the table, a carefully arranged bookshelf, rugs braided from old clothing, softened the cabin's utilitarian nature. More significantly, they grew to know each other better with each passing day. Kieran taught Delaney the basics of ranch work, how to feed the animals properly, the importance of checking fences, the signs that foretold weather changes. She proved an eager student, approaching each new task with determination despite occasional missteps. In turn, Delaney shared her knowledge of account keeping, showing Kieran how to track his finances more effectively than the haphazard system he'd been using. Her education in St. Louis had included not only traditional female accomplishments, but also practical business skills her forward-thinking father had insisted upon. Evenings were spent in conversation that ranged from childhood memories to hopes for their shared future. Kieran spoke of his family in Pennsylvania, of the brother whose death had driven him westward, of the war experiences he'd never shared with another soul. Delaney described her life in St. Louis, the loss of her mother and sister, her father's decline after their deaths. Each revelation, each shared confidence, strengthened the bond between them. Physical affection remained restrained but grew increasingly difficult to limit. Their first kiss had opened a door neither could fully close again. Hands sought each other across the table, bodies drew closer during evening readings, good-night embraces lingered longer each night. Both were grateful when word came that the preacher would arrive the following Sunday. "Are you certain you don't want to wait longer?" Kieran asked the night before their wedding. "Give yourself more time to be sure." They sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him. Delaney tilted her face up to meet his concerned gaze. "I've never been more certain of anything," she assured him. "Have you changed your mind?" "God, no," he tightened his embrace. "I'd marry you this instant if I could." She smiled, reaching up to touch his face, then stopped worrying. "Tomorrow I'll become your wife, and we can begin our life together properly." "Mrs. Delaney Keller," he murmured, testing the sound of it, "it suits you." "I think so too," she nestled closer against him. "Though I admit to some nerves about tomorrow night." Kieran felt heat rise in his face at her meaning. That is, there's no rush for." Her soft laughter interrupted his stammering. "I'm not afraid of becoming your wife in every sense, Kieran. Just a little nervous, as any bride would be." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his heart full. "We have a lifetime to learn each other. Nothing needs to happen until you're ready." "I love you," she whispered, the words still new enough to send a thrill through him each time she spoke them. "And I love you," he returned, marveling at how naturally the phrase now came to his lips. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the February sun casting long blue shadows across pristine snow. Kieran rose early, completing his chores with efficient haste before riding to town to meet the preacher. Delaney remained at the cabin, preparing herself for the ceremony and the small celebration that would follow. By noon, Kieran returned with Preacher Thomas, a kind-faced man in his 50s who traveled a circuit of frontier settlements ministering to the scattered faithful. They were followed shortly by the few guests Kieran had invited: Marshall Watson and his wife, the Millers from the general store, and 3 neighboring ranchers with whom he had maintained cordial if distant relations. The cabin, though small, accommodated them all comfortably thanks to Delaney's rearrangements. When she emerged from behind the curtain they'd hung to create a private dressing area, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. She wore the blue dress Kieran had purchased in town, now altered to fit her slender frame perfectly. Her chestnut hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, adorned with a small spray of dried wildflowers Mrs. Miller had brought as a wedding gift. Though she wore no jewelry save the silver locket around her neck, she radiated a beauty that needed no enhancement. Kieran, watching her approach, felt his breath catch. She seemed to glow with an inner light, her hazel eyes finding his across the small space. In that moment, all his doubts about their rapid courtship vanished. This was right. This was meant to be. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, frontier practicality blending with genuine reverence. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When Preacher Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers present. A modest feast followed, venison roast, fresh bread misses. Miller had brought preserved fruits and a small cake that was the storekeeper's wife's specialty. The guests offered toasts and well wishes, treating Delaney with the warm acceptance characteristic of frontier communities. "You've chosen well, Keller," Marshal Watson said quietly as the celebration continued. "She's a fine woman." "Better than I deserve," Kieran agreed, watching Delaney laugh at something Mrs. Miller had said. "Nonsense," the lawman clapped him on the shoulder. "Every man deserves happiness, even solitary ones like yourself, perhaps especially those." By late afternoon, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in their cabin. An unaccustomed shyness fell between them, both aware that everything had changed with the speaking of their vows. "I should check on the animals," Kieran said, needing a moment to collect himself. Delaney nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll clear up here." Outside, the crisp air cleared his head. Kieran moved through his familiar routine, feeding the horses and cattle, ensuring all was secure for the night. The ordinary tasks grounded him, reminded him that while much had changed, the foundation of his life, this land, these responsibilities, remained constant. Only now he would share them, no longer bearing the burden alone. When he returned to the cabin, he found Delaney had transformed it once again. The remains of the celebration had been cleared away, the fire built up to a cheerful blaze. Most notably, the bed had been made with fresh linens, a wedding gift from Mrs. Miller, and turned down invitingly. Delaney herself stood by the window, watching the last rays of sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. She had removed the flowers from her hair, and the chestnut waves now fell loosely down her back. "It's beautiful," she said as he closed the door behind him. "I never truly appreciated how beautiful Montana could be until I stopped fearing it." Kieran moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers naturally. "It can be harsh, but there's a honesty in that harshness. The land doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. Like its people." She turned to face him, her expression open and vulnerable. "Like you, Kieran Keller." He reached up to touch her face gently. "I'm not sure I deserve such praise." "You do," her eyes held his steadily. "You're the most honest, honorable man I've ever known. And now you're my husband." The word sent a surge of emotion through him, pride, joy, and a fierce protectiveness. "And you're my wife." Their lips met in a kiss unlike any they'd shared before, deeper, more certain, sealed with the promises they'd made before God and witnesses. Kieran's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as her hands threaded through his hair. When they finally parted, both breathless, Delaney rested her forehead against his chest. "I never imagined finding this kind of happiness," she murmured. "When I fled St. Louis, I hoped only for safety, for escape. I never dreamed I would find a home, find love." "When I found you in that barn," Kieran said, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought I was simply doing what anyone would do, bringing a stranger in from the cold. I didn't realize I was rescuing my own future." She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes despite her smile. "Perhaps we rescued each other." The observation struck him as profoundly true. He had saved her from freezing. She had saved him from the cold isolation he'd built around himself. Both had been lost in their own ways until fate or providence had brought them together. "I love you, Delaney Keller," he said, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "And I love you." She took his hand, her expression shifting to something both shy and determined. "Come to bed, husband, the night grows cold." With tender reverence, they consummated their marriage, each touch, each whispered endearment a further binding of their souls. Kieran, who had known only fleeting physical connections in the years since the war, found himself overwhelmed by the intimacy they shared. It was not merely bodies joining, but a complete union of hearts and minds, a fulfillment of the promises they had made. Afterward, as Delaney slept peacefully in his arms, Kieran gazed at the cabin ceiling, marveling at how completely his life had transformed in less than 2 weeks. The space that had once felt like adequate shelter now truly felt like home. The future that had seemed predetermined, solitary, austere, now stretched before him, filled with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Outside, snow began falling again, gentle flakes drifting past the window in the moonlight. But now, instead of representing isolation, the snow seemed to cocoon them, creating a private world where their love could take root and flourish. Kieran tightened his arm around his sleeping wife, gratitude filling his chest. Sometimes, it seemed, the harshest storms brought the greatest blessings. Sometimes shelter could be found not just in walls and roof, but in another's heart. He pressed a gentle kiss to Delaney's forehead and closed his eyes, certain for the first time in years that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he would not face them alone. Spring came slowly to Montana, as it always did, a gradual softening rather than a sudden transformation. March brought warming days and freezing nights, creating treacherous conditions as snow melted and refroze. April delivered the first tentative green shoots, pushing through remaining patches of white. By May, the landscape had fully awakened, vibrant with new growth and possibility. Throughout these changing seasons, Kieran and Delaney built their life together with the same care they might use to construct a cabin, laying a solid foundation, raising sturdy walls, creating a structure designed to withstand whatever storms might come. Their marriage quickly settled into comfortable rhythms. Mornings found them rising early to share the ranch work, Delaney proving herself increasingly capable with each passing day. She learned to milk the cow Kieran purchased at the spring auction, to recognize signs of illness in the livestock, to plant and tend the kitchen garden that would supplement their meals. Kieran, for his part, discovered the joy of partnership after years of solitude. Tasks that had once seemed tedious became pleasant when shared with his wife. Conversations over meals replaced the silence that had previously filled his days. Decisions about the ranch's future became joint ventures rather than solitary burdens. Their evenings developed comfortable patterns, shared meals, reading aloud from Whitman or the few other books they owned, making plans for improvements to the ranch. Later, in the privacy of their bed, they explored the physical dimensions of their love, each discovering in the other's embrace a passion neither had known was possible. Spring also brought practical changes to their home. With Delaney's encouragement, Kieran added a small second room to the cabin, a private bedroom that offered them space separate from the main living area. They constructed a proper chicken coop, started a larger vegetable garden, and repaired fences damaged during winter storms. Their occasional trips to Silver Creek revealed the community's growing acceptance of Delaney. Initial curiosity about Kieran's sudden marriage had given way to genuine appreciation for his wife's friendly nature and willingness to contribute. She quickly became involved in the small settlement's limited social activities, attending the monthly quilting circle, helping organize the Spring Founders' Day celebration, offering assistance when Mrs. Watson delivered a difficult first child. Through it all, they grew closer, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, discovering how to navigate disagreements, building the intimate understanding that forms the core of a strong marriage. Kieran found himself smiling more, laughing often, the burden of grief he'd carried since his brother's death gradually lightening under Delaney's loving influence. Yet beneath their evident happiness ran a current of unresolved concern. Despite Marshal Watson's inquiries, no confirmation had come regarding Delaney's uncle in Helena. More troubling, no word had reached them about Harlan, the man she'd fled in St. Louis. The lack of pursuit seemed almost more worrying than active searching would have been. "Perhaps he's given up," Delaney suggested one evening in late May as they sat on their newly built porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "Realized I've gone too far to be worth pursuing." Kieran frowned, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Men like that, men who view women as property to be acquired, rarely surrender their claims so easily. It's been nearly 4 months, she pointed out. If he meant to find me, surely he would have made some effort by now. Unless he's being methodical, Kieran countered, working his way westward systematically, following the stage routes. Delaney sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. You think I'm being naive? I think we should remain cautious, he corrected gently. I won't have you looking over your shoulder forever, but neither should we assume the danger has passed completely. She nodded, understanding his concern. What do you suggest? For now, continue as we have been. You're known in the community as my wife now. That offers considerable protection. But we should also consider visiting Helena ourselves, perhaps when the summer cattle drive is complete. To find my uncle, Delaney asked. To establish your presence officially, Kieran explained. Register our marriage with territorial authorities, perhaps consult a lawyer about formally protecting your status. The more documentation we create, the harder it would be for anyone to challenge your choices. The practicality of his suggestion reassured her. You've thought this through carefully. I've thought of little else, he admitted. Keeping you safe, keeping our life together secure, it's become my primary concern. Delaney turned in his embrace, bringing her hand to his cheek. I married a good man. You married a cautious one, he corrected with a small smile. But on this matter, caution seems warranted. She kissed him then, a tender affirmation of the bond between them. As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, speaking of more pleasant matters, the calves growing strong in the spring pastures, the wildflowers carpeting the meadow beyond their fence line, plans for a proper barn raising later in the summer. June arrived with lengthening days and increasing warmth. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, the small herd growing healthier, the garden producing its first tender vegetables, the newly acquired chickens providing eggs in abundance. Their cabin, once Spartan in its simplicity, had become a true home, filled with small comforts and personal touches that reflected their shared life. It was during this season of growth and promise that the past Delaney had fled finally caught up with them. The day began like any other, early rising, shared breakfast, division of necessary tasks. Kieran had ridden out to check the northern fence line, leaving Delaney to tend the garden and prepare for canning the early berries they'd gathered the previous day. She was kneeling among the neat rows of vegetables, a wide-brimmed hat protecting her from the June sun, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Visitors were rare enough that any arrival warranted notice. Rising to her feet, Delaney shaded her eyes against the sunlight. A single rider approached from the direction of Silver Creek, his horse moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. As he drew closer, she could see he was well dressed for the frontier. A black coat despite the summer heat, a neatly trimmed beard framing features that might have been handsome if not for their cold expression. Recognition hit her like a physical blow. Victor Harlan, the man she'd fled across half a continent. For a moment, Delaney considered running to the cabin for Kieran's spare revolver, to the barn for a horse, to the fields where her husband worked. But pride and newfound courage kept her rooted in place. This was her home, she would not flee from it. Mrs. Evans, Harlan called as he reined his horse to a stop at their gate, or should I say, the former Miss Evans. I've been looking for you for quite some time. Delaney straightened her spine, grateful that her wide-brimmed hat might partially conceal her expression. Mr. Harlan, you're far from St. Louis. Indeed, he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to quality horses. A journey made necessary by your impetuous departure. Not impetuous, she corrected firmly, carefully considered and absolutely necessary. Harlan's mouth tightened beneath his beard. We clearly have different perspectives on that matter. He glanced around the modest homestead with poorly concealed disdain. May I come in? The ride from town was dustier than I anticipated. My husband isn't home, Delaney said, the statement both warning and explanation. It wouldn't be proper to entertain a male visitor alone. Husband? Harlan's eyebrows rose. How expedient of you. The implication stung, but Delaney refused to show it. Mr. Keller and I were married in February. The preacher can verify it, as can the marshal in half the town of Silver Creek. A frontier marriage, Harlan said dismissively. Hardly the same as a proper union sanctified in civilization. The same in the eyes of God and the law, she countered, her voice steadier than she felt. What do you want, Mr. Harlan? Why have you come all this way? He stepped closer to the gate, his gloved hands resting on the rough wood. Initially, to bring you back to fulfill your obligations. Your father's debts remain unpaid, as you well know. My father owed you money, not my hand in marriage, Delaney said, and whatever financial obligations existed died with him under Missouri law. Is that what your husband told you? Harlan's smile didn't reach his eyes. How convenient for him to acquire both a wife and absolution from debt in one transaction. Confusion flickered through Delaney. What are you talking about? Your precious Kieran Keller, Harlan said, watching her face carefully. The man you so hastily married. Did he mention that he served with your father during the war, that he was present when Captain Evans was mortally wounded at Vicksburg, that he promised a dying man he would look after his daughter? The world seemed to tilt beneath Delaney's feet. You're lying. Am I? Harlan reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. I have here a letter from your father to me, dated just weeks before his death. In it, he mentions entrusting certain family matters to Lieutenant Keller, who has sworn to honor our arrangement regarding Delaney's future. She stared at the paper he held, recognizing her father's handwriting even from a distance. That proves nothing. My father knew many soldiers. Ask your husband about Captain William Evans, Harlan suggested, replacing the letter in his pocket. Watch his face when you do. Then decide who has been truthful with you. Before Delaney could formulate a response, the sound of another horse approaching drew both their attentions. Kieran was returning, riding hard as though he'd spotted the unfamiliar visitor from a distance. It appears the man himself arrives, Harlan observed. Perfect timing. Kieran reined his horse to an abrupt halt, dismounting in a fluid motion that spoke of wartime cavalry training. His expression was carefully neutral, but Delaney could see the tension in his shoulders, the alertness in his stance. Can I help you? He asked the stranger, moving to stand protectively near Delaney. Victor Harlan, the visitor introduced himself with a slight bow. From St. Louis, I believe you and I have a mutual acquaintance in the late Captain Evans. Delaney watched her husband's face closely, praying Harlan was lying, that Kieran would show only confusion at the name. Instead, she saw recognition flash across his features, quickly masked but undeniably present. You knew my father? She asked quietly. Kieran's eyes met hers, a complex mixture of emotions visible in their depths. Delaney, I can explain. So it's true, the confirmation hit her like a physical blow. You served with him during the war. Yes, but it's not what you. Did you know who I was when you found me in your barn? The question emerged sharper than she'd intended, hurt making her voice brittle. Kieran shook his head emphatically. No, God, no, Delaney. I had no idea until you told me your name the next morning. But you recognized it, she pressed. You knew exactly who I was then, didn't you? His hesitation was answer enough. Delaney took a step back, arms wrapping around herself as though for protection. Unfortunate that such secrets exist between newlyweds, Harlan observed, clearly pleased by the scene unfolding before him. One might almost question the foundation of such a hasty union. This doesn't concern you, Kieran said coldly, turning to face the other man. I suggest you leave my property. Harlan raised an eyebrow. I came to speak with Miss Evans, forgive me, Mrs. Keller, about matters of inheritance and obligation, matters that clearly intersect with your own interests. Whatever business you believe you have with my wife can be addressed through proper legal channels, Kieran stated firmly. Not by arriving unannounced at our home. Legal channels, Harlan repeated with a thin smile. Yes, I imagine those would interest you greatly, given the circumstances of your marriage. Tell me, did you inform your bride of your promise to her father before or after the ceremony? Delaney watched the exchange with growing confusion and distress. What promise? What arrangement? The solid ground of her new life seemed to be crumbling beneath her feet. "Mr. Harlan," she interjected, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I think it would be best if you left now. Whatever you came to say has been said." "Not quite all," Harlan countered, "but I can see this initial conversation has been illuminating enough for one day." He turned back to his horse, mounting with practiced ease. "I'll be staying at the Silver Creek Hotel for the next week, should either of you wish to discuss these matters further. Particularly the question of Captain Evans's estate, which remains in legal limbo due to your abrupt departure." With a tip of his hat that managed to be both polite and mocking, Harlan turned his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. For long moments after he disappeared from view, Delaney and Kieran remained motionless, the space between them suddenly vast despite their physical proximity. "Delaney," Kieran began finally, his voice strained. "Please let me explain." She turned to face him fully, struggling to reconcile the man she loved with this new revelation. "You knew my father." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes. I served under him briefly during the Vicksburg campaign." "And you recognized my name when I told you who I was?" Kieran nodded slowly. "I did. It's not a common name, and when you mentioned St. Louis." "Yes, I realized who you must be." "Yet you said nothing." The hurt in her voice was unmistakable. "All these months, all our conversations about our pasts, and you never once mentioned that you knew my father." "I was going to tell you," he insisted, taking a step toward her, stopping when she instinctively backed away. "I wanted to find the right moment, the right way to explain." "Explain what?" Delaney demanded. "What arrangement was Harlan referring to? What promise did you make to my father?" Kieran ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with how to proceed. "It's complicated, and not what Harlan is implying." "Then uncomplicate it," she challenged. "Tell me the truth, Kieran, all of it." He drew a deep breath as if bracing himself. "Your father saved my life at Vicksburg. We were pinned down under Confederate fire. I'd been shot in the leg, couldn't move. He carried me to safety despite the risk to himself." Delaney listened silently, her arms still wrapped protectively around her middle. "Afterward, when we were recovering in the same field hospital, we talked. He spoke often of his family, his wife and daughters back in St. Louis. He showed me a small photograph he carried. You were perhaps 16 then." "The daguerreotype," Delaney murmured, remembering the portrait her father had commissioned before leaving for war. "He always kept it with him." Kieran nodded. "When it became clear he wouldn't survive his wounds, he asked certain things of me, to deliver letters to his family, to check on his business partner, Harlan, whom he trusted to manage affairs in his absence." "And," Delaney prompted when he paused, "and to look in on his daughters if I ever found myself in St. Louis after the war," Kieran finished. "To ensure you were being treated fairly by his partner, who would become your guardian if your mother preceded him in death." "That's all." Something in his expression told her there was more. Kieran hesitated again. "He mentioned that he hoped you would make a suitable marriage when you came of age, that Harlan had expressed interest, though you were too young then for such considerations." Delaney felt ill. "My father wanted me to marry Victor Harlan." "No," Kieran's response was immediate and emphatic. "He said only that Harlan had mentioned the possibility. Your father's primary concern was your welfare, your happiness." "Yet you never fulfilled this promise," she observed. "You never came to St. Louis, never checked on me." Guilt flashed across Kieran's features. "I intended to. After the war ended, I made it as far as St. Louis. I even found your father's house, but I couldn't do it," he admitted. "I was too broken then, too haunted by what I'd seen, what I'd done. The thought of facing a grieving family, of being the one to deliver final messages from a dead man. I couldn't bear it." Self-recrimination etched deep lines around his mouth. So I left the letters with a neighbor and continued west, telling myself someone else would ensure Captain Evans's family was cared for. The revelation settled between them, heavy with implications. Delaney tried to process what she'd heard, to reconcile it with the man she believed she knew. "When I told you my name that morning in the cabin," she said slowly, "you realized who I was. You recognized my father's surname, connected it to St. Louis." "Yes." "And you said nothing. For months you said nothing." Kieran's expression was pained. "At first I didn't know how to bring it up. Then as we grew closer, I feared what you would think of me. That I had failed to honor my promise to your father, that I had abandoned your family when they might have needed assistance. Did you marry me because of that promise?" The question emerged barely above a whisper, but its impact was immediate. "No." Kieran moved toward her, and this time she didn't back away. "Delaney, no, I married you because I love you, because finding you changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted from life." "But the guilt was there," she pressed. "The knowledge that you had made a promise and broken it." He couldn't deny it. "Yes, the guilt was there, but it wasn't the reason I asked you to be my wife." Delaney closed her eyes briefly, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions coursing through her. Betrayal at the omission, hurt that he hadn't trusted her with the truth, confusion about what this meant for them, for the life they'd built. "I need time," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Time to think about what this means." "Of course." Kieran's voice was thick with restrained emotion. "Whatever you need." "I'll be in the cabin." Without waiting for his response, Delaney turned and walked away, her steps measured despite the trembling in her limbs. Inside, she sank onto a chair, staring unseeing at the home they'd created together. The revelation of Kieran's connection to her father, his deliberate silence about it, cast a shadow over everything she'd believed about their relationship. Had their meeting truly been chance? Or had some subconscious recognition, some sense of obligation, influenced his decision to bring her into his home that night? More troubling still were Harlan's insinuations about her father's estate. She had fled St. Louis believing her inheritance consisted only of modest personal effects, and whatever small sum remained after her father's debts were settled. Had there been more? Had Harlan concealed assets that rightfully belonged to her? As the afternoon waned into evening, Delaney remained inside, her thoughts circling without resolution. Kieran respected her request for space, staying outside to complete the day's necessary work. When darkness fell, he entered the cabin only long enough to collect a blanket before returning to sleep in the barn, giving her the privacy she had implicitly requested. That night, alone in the bed they had shared since their wedding, Delaney wept, for the father she had loved but perhaps never fully known, for the trust in her husband that had been shaken, for the certainty about her future that had been replaced with doubt. Morning brought no clarity, only a dull ache in her chest and the knowledge that decisions must be made. After a sleepless night, Delaney rose with the dawn, dressed carefully, and prepared a simple breakfast. When Kieran entered cautiously from his night in the barn, she gestured for him to join her at the table. "We need to go to Silver Creek," she said without preamble. "I need to hear whatever Harlan has to say, to understand exactly what claims he's making." Kieran nodded, relief evident in his expression at her willingness to address the situation directly. "Of course. We can leave as soon as the morning chores are complete." "And afterward," she continued, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to have a longer conversation about everything you didn't tell me." "Yes," he met her gaze steadily. "I owe you that much and more." The ride to Silver Creek passed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The small settlement appeared unchanged, unaware of the personal drama unfolding among two of its newest residents. They left their horses at the livery stable and made their way to the modest hotel where Harlan had said he would be staying. They found him in the small dining room, enjoying a late breakfast with the unhurried air of a man accustomed to leisure. His expression registered satisfaction when he saw them approach, though he quickly masked it with polite surprise. "Mr. and Mrs. Keller," he greeted them, rising from his seat. "Please join me. I've just ordered coffee." We're not here for social pleasantries, Kieran said flatly. No, pity. Harlan gestured to the empty chairs regardless, but perhaps practical matters can be discussed more comfortably while seated. Delaney took a chair, maintaining her composure through sheer determination. You mentioned my father's estate yesterday. I want to know exactly what you meant by that. Harlan signaled for additional cups as he resumed his seat. Direct like your father, very well. The simple fact is that Captain Evans's business affairs were more substantial than you were led to believe following his death. Meaning, Kieran prompted when Harlan paused to sip his coffee. Meaning that the import business he and I operated had significant holdings, warehouses, shipping contracts, inventory, that were not liquidated to settle his debts as you were told. Harlan directed his explanation to Delaney. Rather, those assets were held in trust, ostensibly, until you reached an age where you could make informed decisions about their disposition. In trust managed by you, Delaney observed, naturally. As your father's business partner and the executor of his will, I was the logical choice. Harlan's smile was thin. The arrangement was meant to culminate in our marriage, at which point your father's share of the business would transfer fully to my management as your husband. And when I refused your proposal, Delaney asked. You complicated matters considerably, Harlan admitted. Legally, the assets remain in trust for you until you reach 25 or marry with the approval of the trustee, myself. Your hasty union in the wilderness creates an interesting legal question. There was nothing hasty about our marriage, Kieran interjected. It was performed properly with witnesses by an ordained minister. Yes, but without the consent of Miss Evans's legal guardian, Harlan countered smoothly. A requirement under Missouri law for a woman of her age and circumstances. Delaney felt her chest tighten. You were never appointed my guardian. When my father died, I was already of majority age in Missouri. For most purposes, yes, Harlan agreed. But the terms of your father's will specify that any marriage before your 25th birthday required trustee approval for you to access your inheritance. A common provision to protect young women from fortune hunters. The implication hung in the air, directed unmistakably at Kieran. Delaney felt a surge of protective anger despite her own unresolved feelings about her husband's omissions. If you're suggesting that Kieran married me for financial gain, you're mistaken, she said firmly. He had no knowledge of any inheritance. Didn't he? Harlan raised an eyebrow. A man who served with your father, who knew of his business success, who by his own admission was aware of your identity. I find that difficult to believe. Believe what you will, Kieran said coldly. The fact remains that I married Delaney because I love her, not because of any promised fortune. Harlan's expression suggested skepticism, but he didn't press the point directly. Instead, he withdrew several folded documents from his coat pocket. In any case, the legal situation is this. As trustee, I can challenge the validity of your marriage in terms of inheritance rights, or, he paused meaningfully, I can choose to recognize it, allowing Mrs. Keller immediate access to her father's estate, which, I should mention, is valued at approximately $30,000. The sum was staggering by frontier standards, enough to transform their modest ranch into one of the largest operations in the territory, with money left for considerable comfort. Delaney saw Kieran's eyes widen slightly before his expression returned to careful neutrality. And what would such recognition cost? Kieran asked, clearly anticipating conditions. Harlan spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. Merely proper documentation and a formal acknowledgement of my role in managing the estate these past years. Oh, and a modest fee for my services, say 20% of the total value. $6,000, Delaney calculated quickly. For doing what was already your legal obligation. For preserving and growing assets that might otherwise have been lost, Harlan corrected smoothly. Your father's share of our business was worth perhaps $15,000 at his death. Through careful management, I've doubled its value. Or through deliberate concealment, you've kept what rightfully belonged to Delaney all along, Kieran suggested, his voice hard. Harlan's pleasant demeanor slipped momentarily, revealing the calculation beneath. Accusations of impropriety would be difficult to prove, especially from the wilderness of Montana territory. Courts tend to favor those who appear before them in person, with proper legal representation. The threat was clear. Challenging him would mean returning to St. Louis, engaging in potentially lengthy legal battles with uncertain outcomes. Delaney felt the weight of the choice before them, complicated further by the unresolved questions about Kieran's honesty. "We need time to consider our options," she said finally. "Of course," Harlan nodded magnanimously. "I'll remain in Silver Creek until the end of the week. Should you decide to proceed amicably, I have the necessary paperwork prepared. Should you choose a more adversarial approach, I'll see you in St. Louis." With that, he rose, bowed slightly, and left them sitting at the table, the implications of his revelations hanging heavily between them. The ride back to their ranch was as silent as the journey into town had been, though for different reasons. Now their thoughts were filled not only with questions of trust and honesty, but also with practical considerations about Harlan's claims and offers. Only when they reached the privacy of their cabin did Delaney finally speak. "Did you know," she asked simply, "about my inheritance, about Harlan being my father's business partner, any of it?" Kieran shook his head emphatically. "No. Your father mentioned his business in St. Louis, but never in terms of its value or specific arrangements. He spoke of Harlan only as a trusted associate who would ensure his family was provided for if the worst happened." Delaney studied his face, searching for any hint of deception. Finding none, she continued. "And my name, when you realized who I was that morning after finding me in the barn, did it influence your decision to help me, to let me stay?" "Only in that it confirmed you were who you claimed to be," Kieran answered honestly. "I would have helped any stranger in your condition. Learning your identity merely added a sense of, I don't know, perhaps fate to our meeting." She nodded slowly, processing his words. "I believe you. But I'm still hurt that you didn't tell me. That you let me share everything about my past while keeping this connection secret." "I know," remorse was evident in his expression. "I convinced myself it would only complicate things, that it might make you question my motives. The longer I waited, the harder it became to find the right moment. And now Harlan has used it to try to drive a wedge between us," Delaney observed bitterly. "Has he succeeded?" The question was asked quietly, vulnerability evident in Kieran's eyes. Delaney considered before answering. "No," she said finally, "he hasn't. I'm hurt by your silence, but I know your heart, Kieran. These months together have shown me the man you truly are, not just the promises you made or failed to keep years ago." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you for that. I don't deserve your understanding, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless." "This doesn't mean there aren't consequences," she cautioned. "Trust is built on honesty. We'll need to rebuild what's been damaged." "I know," he agreed soberly. "And I will spend however long it takes earning back your complete trust." Delaney moved toward him then, closing the physical distance that had existed between them since Harlan's arrival. When she reached him, she took his hands in hers, a simple gesture that nonetheless communicated her willingness to work through this challenge together. "Now," she said with new determination, "we need to decide how to handle Harlan and his claims about my inheritance." Kieran squeezed her hands gently. "What do you want to do? This is your decision, your inheritance, your past." "Our future," she corrected. "Whatever I decide affects us both." He nodded in acknowledgement. "Then let's consider our options carefully." Throughout the remainder of the day, they discussed the situation from every angle. If Harlan was telling the truth about the value of her inheritance, accepting his terms would transform their lives materially, allowing for expansion of the ranch, improvements to their home, security against lean years. But it would also mean acknowledging his authority, potentially legitimizing what might have been years of fraudulent management. Fighting his claims would require returning to St. Louis, engaging lawyers, potentially becoming entangled in lengthy court proceedings with uncertain outcomes. It would mean leaving their home, the life they'd built, for an unknown period. There's a third option, Delaney said as evening approached. We could simply do nothing, continue our lives as they are, without the inheritance or the complications it would bring. Kieran considered this possibility. Could you be content with that? Knowing what might be rightfully yours is out there, unclaimed. I came west seeking freedom, not fortune, she reminded him. These past months with you have given me more happiness than money ever could. But the practical benefits can't be ignored, Kieran pointed out. That kind of financial security would ensure our ranch survives even the hardest times. It could provide for children, for the future we've talked about building. The mention of children, a topic they discussed with increasing frequency as their marriage deepened, gave Delaney pause. She'd fled St. Louis with little thought beyond immediate escape. Now she had to consider not just her present happiness, but the prosperity of the family they hoped to create. Perhaps there's a middle path, she suggested after further reflection. We accept Harlan's offer, the $24,000 after his fee, but insist on full accounting and legal documentation. We don't challenge the past management, but we ensure everything moving forward is properly recorded and transferred. Kieran nodded slowly. It's a practical compromise. You get the majority of your inheritance without the cost and uncertainty of legal battles. And we deny him the satisfaction of forcing me back to St. Louis or of coming between us, Delaney added. Which I suspect was his true purpose in following me here. You think his offer is less about the money than about power over you? Kieran asked. I think Victor Harlan is a man accustomed to getting what he wants, she said grimly. When I refused his proposal and fled, I damaged his pride. This pursuit is as much about restoring his sense of control as it is about financial considerations. Kieran's expression hardened. All the more reason to resolve this quickly and definitively, so he can return to St. Louis and leave our lives for good. Their decision made, they planned their approach carefully. The next morning they rode back to Silver Creek together, presenting a united front when they met with Harlan at the hotel. We've considered your proposition, Delaney began without preamble. We're prepared to accept with certain conditions. Harlan's smile suggested he had expected no less. I'm listening. First, we require full documentation of all assets comprising my father's estate, with independent verification of their value, Delaney stated firmly. Second, your fee will be calculated based on the actual, verified value, not your estimation. Third, all transfers must be completed before you leave Montana territory. Reasonable terms, Harlan conceded, though his eyes narrowed slightly. I can provide inventories and banking statements. As for verification, the local bank manager should suffice as an independent party. Agreed, Kieran said. We'll also need the marshal to witness all document signings. This additional requirement clearly annoyed Harlan, though he maintained his composed facade. As you wish, though I fail to see the necessity for such official oversight. Consider it a formality for all our protection, Delaney suggested with false sweetness. After all, transactions of this magnitude should be properly documented. The negotiations continued through the day, with Harlan producing surprisingly detailed records of Evans Import Company's holdings, bank statements from reputable St. Louis financial institutions, and legal documents establishing the trust and its conditions. Marshal Watson was called to verify the proceedings, bringing with him the town's notary to authenticate signatures. By evening, the matter was resolved, at least on paper. Delaney had signed the necessary documents acknowledging Harlan's management of the trust and accepting the transfer of assets, which indeed totaled close to the amount he had claimed. In return, Harlan provided bank drafts and legal title to properties in St. Louis that would now be liquidated and transferred to Delaney's name at the Territorial Bank. I trust this concludes our business, Kieran said as the final document was signed and sealed. Almost, Harlan replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. There remains the small matter of Captain Evans's personal effects, letters, military commendations, family heirlooms. items of sentimental rather than monetary value, which I took the liberty of bringing with me. The mention of such personal connections to her father caught Delaney off guard. You brought them here, all the way from St. Louis. I anticipated a successful resolution to our negotiations, Harlan explained smoothly. The trunk is at my hotel. I'll have it delivered to your ranch tomorrow before my departure. Despite her lingering distrust of the man, Delaney felt a surge of gratitude at the thought of reclaiming these tangible links to her father. Thank you for that consideration, at least. Harlan bowed slightly. Whatever our differences, I respected your father greatly. It seems fitting his personal legacy should pass to his daughter, regardless of other circumstances. With that surprisingly gracious note, their business was concluded. Harlan would leave on the next stage, returning to St. Louis with his substantial fee, but without the satisfaction of having truly disrupted Delaney's new life. She and Kieran would remain in Montana, their ranch's future now secured by an unexpected inheritance, their marriage tested but ultimately strengthened by the challenge. As they rode home in the gathering twilight, Delaney felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not just the resolution with Harlan, but also the clearing of secrets between her and Kieran. For the first time since her flight from St. Louis, she felt truly free of the past's shadow. Are you all right? Kieran asked, noticing her pensive expression. Delaney turned to him with a smile that reached her eyes. Better than all right. I feel as though we've closed one chapter and can now fully begin another, together, without ghosts between us. His answering smile held all the love and relief she could have hoped for. That's all I've wanted since the moment I found you. The trunk arrived the next morning as promised, a handsome leather-bound container filled with precisely what Harlan had described. Her father's military uniform and decorations, family photographs, personal correspondence, and small keepsakes that had once adorned their St. Louis home. Most precious were the letters her father had written during the war, including several addressed to Delaney herself that had never been delivered. That evening, sitting before the fire in their cabin, she read these messages from the past while Kieran sat beside her, offering silent support. The letters revealed a father who had loved her deeply, who had worried about her future, who had indeed considered Harlan a potential suitor but had explicitly written that, "My daughter's happiness must be her own to determine, her heart her own to give." Most surprising was a letter dated just days before his death, the one Kieran had been meant to deliver but couldn't bring himself to face her family. In it, her father wrote of the young lieutenant who had served under him, describing Kieran as a man of uncommon integrity despite his youth, and noting that, should Providence ever bring him to your acquaintance, I would count it a blessing, for men of his character are rare in this world grown harsh with war. He would have approved of us, Delaney said softly, showing Kieran the passage. Of our marriage. Kieran read the words with visible emotion. I wish I'd been brave enough to deliver this to you years ago, to honor his faith in me. Perhaps things happened exactly as they were meant to, she suggested, taking his hand. If you had come to St. Louis then, we would have met under entirely different circumstances. You might not have stayed. I might have been too young to recognize what you would come to mean to me. And instead, we found each other in a snowstorm on the Montana frontier, Kieran mused. Maybe your father's blessing found a way to reach us after all. Delaney leaned against his shoulder, feeling a sense of completion, of circles closing. I believe it did. In the days that followed, they began planning for their future with newfound security and purpose. The inheritance would allow for expansion of their herd, construction of a larger barn, improvements to their cabin, and savings against future hardships. More importantly, it provided a foundation for the family they hoped to build, children who would grow up knowing both the value of honest work and the security of material provision. Summer deepened around them, bringing the anticipated cattle drive, successful negotiations with new buyers, and the barn raising they had planned with neighboring ranchers. Their life together settled back into its rhythms, stronger for having weathered its first serious challenge. As autumn approached, bringing golden light and crisp mornings to the Montana landscape, Delaney confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was expecting their first child, due to arrive with the spring thaw. The news filled Kieran with a joy he hadn't believed possible, transforming the already contented man into one who approached each day with renewed purpose and wonder. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" Delaney asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Her hand rested protectively over the subtle swell of her stomach, where their child grew stronger each day. Kieran covered her hand with his own. "Sometimes, if that stage hadn't overturned, if you hadn't found my barn in the blizzard. If you hadn't made a promise to my father years ago, setting events in motion neither of us could have foreseen," she added softly. He nodded, understanding her meaning. Life has a strange way of bringing things full circle. "I'm grateful for it," Delaney said, leaning against him. "For the storm that brought me to your barn, for your kindness in bringing me in from the cold, for everything that followed." "Even the difficult parts?" Kieran asked, thinking of Harlan's arrival and the truths it had forced into the open. "Even those," she confirmed. "They're part of our story now, how we found each other, how we chose each other despite complications, how we built this life together." As twilight deepened around them, Kieran thought about the lonely cowboy he had been less than a year ago, convinced that isolation was safer than connection, that the frontier demanded solitude rather than community. How wrong he had been. How fortunate that life had sent Delaney Evans to freeze in his barn, forcing him to offer not just physical shelter but, eventually, the warmth of his heart as well. "I love you," he said simply, the words now as natural as breathing, "more than I ever thought possible." Delaney smiled, the expression lighting her face in the gathering dusk. "And I love you, Kieran Keller. Today, tomorrow, and all the days that follow." Above them the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, constant, enduring, a reminder that some things, once found, remain forever. Like the love that had brought them together against all odds, that had transformed two solitary journeys into one shared path forward. Together, they watched night claim the land they now shared, no longer merely a ranch but truly a home, built on promises kept, and a love that had indeed offered shelter from life's coldest storms.